Inside the richest mansion in the city, a baby was dying, and no one knew why. But when the maid found a bottle hidden behind the crib, the truth she uncovered would expose a secret more deadly than poison. Ruth Thompson had worked in the Sterling mansion for 12 long years, blending into the background like part of the furniture she cleaned. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, polishing the marble floors until they gleamed like mirrors and wiping down chandeliers that sparkled above people who never noticed her. The Sterlings were old money, people who spoke softly but looked down hard, and Ruth had learned that in that world, silence kept you safe. But that morning, something pierced through her routine, a sound she couldn't ignore. It was the baby's cry. Little William, just 8 months old, usually had a strong, clear wail that filled the nursery with life. But today, it was weak, thin, like air escaping a balloon. Ruth froze in the doorway, mop in hand, and listened again. It wasn't just crying, it was pain, the kind that comes from something deep inside. When she peeked into the nursery, her heart broke. The baby's cheeks had sunken in. His little arms looked like fragile twigs. His eyes, once bright and curious, were dull now, barely tracking the mobile above his crib. Something was terribly wrong. She asked softly, "Ma'am, is the baby okay?" Victoria turned around slowly. She was Robert Sterling's new girlfriend. Tall, beautiful, the kind of woman who belonged on magazine covers, not in kitchens. Her voice was smooth like ice water when she replied, "He's fine, Ruth. It's just his special imported formula. Doctor's orders." Then she smiled, a smile that never reached her eyes, and turned away. Ruth wanted to believe her. She really did. But when she went to clean later that day, she noticed the bottle of formula. It smelled strange. Not sour like spoiled milk, but sharp, chemical, wrong. A scent that lingered in her throat long after she walked away. Later that week, while wiping down the pantry shelves, Ruth saw the driver, Jake, shove something behind the cleaning products. He looked nervous, sweating in the cool, air-conditioned room. After he left, she pulled it out. A plain, unlabeled bottle. The same milky liquid. Her hands trembled. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she knew it wasn't baby food. And suddenly, everything clicked. Victoria had moved in barely 6 weeks after Robert's wife, William's mother, died in that accidental car crash. The timing was too neat, too convenient. Ruth remembered the gossip whispered in the laundry room, that Victoria had been seen with Robert even before his wife's death. Everyone thought it was a love story. But now, Ruth wasn't so sure. Robert was hardly ever home anymore. His hotel empire kept him flying between cities, shaking hands and closing deals. Whenever he left, Victoria took over completely. She'd lock the nursery door, tell the nanny to take a break, and stay inside with the baby for a few minutes. Then she'd reappear, calm, collected, and leave the child alone for hours. Ruth would hear William crying through the thick oak doors, cries that went unanswered. Each day, the baby grew weaker. One night, as Ruth was emptying the trash in the nursery, she noticed something glinting under the light. Inside the bin were 3 bottles, each nearly full but slightly cloudy. When she lifted one, the liquid sloshed thin, almost like water. She unscrewed the cap and sniffed. Her stomach turned. It was milk, diluted. But worse, there was something bitter underneath. Something no baby should ever drink. Her knees nearly gave out. She knew right then this wasn't neglect. This was murder, slow and silent. Ruth's hands shook as she wrapped one bottle in a plastic bag and tucked it deep inside her purse. She couldn't call the police yet. Not without proof. People like Robert Sterling didn't face accusations. They crushed them. And a maid like her? No one would believe her over a billionaire's lover. That night, she sat at her kitchen table staring at the bottle under the flickering bulb. She whispered to herself, "Either I save this child, or I die trying." The next morning, she took the bottle to a small clinic on the edge of town. Her cousin, Denise, worked there as a lab technician. Ruth told her everything in a low, trembling voice. Denise didn't ask questions. She just ran the tests. Hours later, when Ruth returned, Denise's face said it all before she even spoke. "There are traces of an infant sedative," she whispered. "This isn't formula, Ruth. It's poison." Ruth's stomach dropped. Her mind spun. It wasn't just about greed or jealousy anymore. It was evil, deliberate evil. Someone was slowly killing that child, right under his father's nose. She stared out the window of the clinic, the world outside moving like nothing had changed. Kids playing, cars passing, life going on. But in that mansion, a baby was dying, and she was the only one who knew the truth, her hands clenched into fists. She'd been invisible her whole life, unseen, unheard, dismissed. But now she carried a truth that could shatter everything. The walls of the Sterling mansion might have been made of marble and money, but behind them a secret was rotting, and Ruth Thompson was done staying silent. She didn't know how yet, or who would believe her. But one thing was certain. She was going back to that mansion, and this time she wasn't just the maid. She was the only line between an innocent child and the darkness closing in. The afternoon sun spilled across the marble steps of the Sterling mansion as Robert's black sedan rolled down the driveway. He was heading to Miami for a business conference, kissing Victoria's cheek before leaving. To anyone watching, it looked like a loving goodbye, the devoted father entrusting his home to a caring woman. But Ruth, standing at the top of the stairs with her cleaning cart, saw the flicker in Victoria's eyes. That wasn't love. It was calculation, the kind that sent a chill crawling up her spine. As the car disappeared beyond the gates, Victoria turned with a smile that didn't belong on a human face. It was too smooth, too perfect, and her eyes, cold as polished glass, lingered on Ruth just a second too long. "I'll be in charge while Robert's gone," she said, her voice sweet and heavy with authority. "You just keep the place tidy. No need to bother with the nursery. I've hired a new nanny." Ruth nodded quietly, but her chest tightened when she saw the young woman arrive an hour later. The girl couldn't have been more than 20, her hands trembling as she cradled William. She looked scared, lost, like someone forced into a role she didn't understand. William whimpered in her arms, too weak to even cry properly. Ruth's instincts screamed again, but she bit her tongue. She needed to watch, to learn, to wait for proof. Outside, through the wide kitchen windows, she noticed Jake, the driver, scrubbing the car with obsessive precision. Over and over, he wiped the same spot, eyes darting toward the mansion. When he bent down to grab something, Ruth caught sight of a motel keychain hanging from the glove box. Her heart skipped. What was the driver of one of the richest families in the city doing with a motel key? That night, the house was unnervingly quiet. Even the baby's weak cries had faded into soft whimpers. Ruth moved silently through the hall, carrying folded linens past the study when she heard laughter. Victoria's laughter. Soft, flirtatious, the kind that made your skin crawl when you knew it wasn't real. She paused by the door, pressing her ear against the polished wood. Inside, Jake's voice followed. "When the will comes out and no one contests it, we'll be free. Tomorrow night, final dose to end this once and for all." Ruth froze in place, the linens slipping from her hands. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Final dose. End this once and for all. They weren't just neglecting the baby. They were killing him. Slowly, deliberately. And tomorrow was supposed to be the end. She backed away, careful not to make a sound. Every creak of the floor felt like thunder in her ears. When she finally reached her small room in the servants' quarters, she sat on the edge of her bed, shaking. Sleep wouldn't come that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw William's tiny face, pale and helpless. By dawn, she had made her choice. She arrived 2 hours early, moving quietly through the kitchen, watching every step Victoria and Jake took. Victoria noticed her immediately and frowned. "Ruth, stay downstairs," she said sharply. "The baby's restless. He needs quiet, restless." That word again. Ruth clenched her jaw. The baby wasn't restless. He was dying. From the hallway, she heard Jake whispering on the phone. His voice was low but steady. "The doctor's ready. She'll sign the death certificate. Sudden infant death syndrome. Clean, no questions." Ruth gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. They had everything planned. The sedative, the cover story, even the fake diagnosis. It was murder disguised as tragedy. When Victoria left later that morning, claiming she had a nail appointment, Ruth knew she had a small window. She raced upstairs the moment the front door closed. The nursery smelled faintly of baby powder and something chemical. The new nanny was nowhere to be found, probably dismissed again. William lay in his crib, his breath shallow, his eyelids fluttering weakly. His tiny fingers twitched, reaching for something that wasn't there. Ruth's eyes swept the room until they landed on a small glass bottle half hidden behind the dresser. She pulled it out and read the label. Chlorpromazine. Restricted use. Her stomach dropped. It was a psychiatric sedative, something used to quiet patients in mental hospitals. She took out her phone and snapped photo after photo. The label, the dosage, the baby's condition, everything. Her hands shook so badly that a few shots came out blurred, but she couldn't stop. She tucked the bottle into her apron pocket just as she heard the front door slam. Victoria was back, early. Ruth barely made it downstairs before the woman stormed through the living room, her voice sharp and trembling with anger. "I don't care," Victoria hissed into the phone. "Not tomorrow, today." Her husband came back early. "It's better this way, less suspicious." Ruth froze in the hallway, her heart pounding. Her husband? That meant Robert was returning sooner than planned. And if they were moving up their plan, that meant the baby didn't have another night left. Then Victoria's next words made her blood turn to ice. "The cleaning lady," she said. "She'll be our innocent witness." Ruth's breath caught. They were going to use her. Make her the one who found the baby dead, crying over him as proof it was all natural. She'd be the perfect witness. Loyal, poor, harmless, and when it was over, no one would ever question Victoria's story. But Ruth wasn't the invisible maid anymore. As Victoria's heels clicked down the hall, Ruth slipped into the pantry, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The evidence she'd gathered burned in her pocket. The photos, the bottle, everything she needed to expose the truth. For years, she had swept away the dirt of others, pretending not to see the ugliness beneath the glitter. But this time the dirt was poison, and it was killing an innocent child. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady now. Whatever it took, she would stop them, because the devil in silk might have thought she owned that mansion. But tonight, Ruth Thompson was taking it back. Evening crept over the Sterling mansion like a shadow swallowing gold. The marble halls dimmed as the sun disappeared, and the soft hum of Victoria's voice carried faintly through the upper corridor, a twisted lullaby that didn't belong in a nursery. Ruth moved quietly, her steps measured, her breath steady. She had been waiting all day for this moment. The evidence she had wasn't enough yet. She needed proof of the act itself. So she hid behind the slightly ajar door of the linen closet, her phone camera angled through the narrow gap, recording. Victoria stood by the crib, her silk robe flowing like liquid fire under the chandelier's faint glow. She moved gracefully, too gracefully, as she prepared the baby's bottle, every motion deliberate. From the drawer she pulled out a small vial, colorless, almost invisible, and unscrewed it. The faint clink of glass echoed like a warning. Ruth zoomed in, her heart hammering. She could see the liquid drip into the milk, a few clear drops mixing with the white, swirling like ghosts. Ruth needed a reason to step inside, to get closer. She picked up a rag and pushed the nursery door open, forcing a calm smile onto her face. "I forgot to ask if you want me to wash the baby's clothes, ma'am," she said gently. Victoria jerked around, startled, her hand trembling as she clutched the bottle. "I told you not to come up here," she snapped, eyes wide. "Sorry, ma'am," Ruth murmured, lowering her gaze just enough to look harmless. "Just wanted everything ready before Mr. Sterling returns tomorrow." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin smile. "That won't be necessary," she said coolly, setting the bottle aside. But Ruth's camera caught it, the open vial on the dresser, the label peeled off, the trembling fingers. Before either of them could say another word, the doorbell rang downstairs. Victoria's expression flickered with annoyance. Finally, she muttered and swept out of the room, the sound of her heels fading down the stairs. Ruth waited a moment, then crept to the window. A silver car had pulled into the driveway, and out stepped a woman in a white coat. Dr. Sandra Martinez, the family's trusted physician. Ruth had seen her before, always arriving quietly, always leaving without a word. This time, Ruth followed. She moved fast and silent, slipping into the hallway and ducking into the pantry near the study. From there, she could see the reflection of the two women through the mirrored cabinet door. Her camera was still rolling, the little red light blinking. Dr. Sandra's voice was calm, professional, but every word cut deeper than a scalpel. "The baby took the final dose 15 minutes ago," she said. "Jake timed it perfectly." Victoria smiled faintly, pouring herself a drink. "By morning it'll be over," she said. "When Robert returns, I'll be there to comfort him." The grieving stepmother. The perfect story. Then they laughed. A soft, elegant laugh that made Ruth's skin crawl. The doctor asked, "And the cleaning lady?" Victoria chuckled. "Ruth? She's perfect. Too dumb to suspect a thing. She'll say the baby was fine when she left." Ruth's hand shook so hard she almost dropped her phone. Dumb? Invisible? They'd used her kindness as camouflage. They thought her silence meant ignorance. But not this time. When she finally slipped out of the pantry, her pulse was racing. She couldn't wait. The baby wouldn't survive the night. She ran through the back door, across the dark garden, to her neighbor's small yellow house next door. Carmen, a retired nurse, opened the door in shock. "Ruth, what happened?" Ruth held out the bottle she'd taken earlier. "I need you to test this," she whispered. Carmen's expression hardened. Within minutes, she was at her kitchen counter, pulling out an old testing kit. The smell that rose from the open bottle made her cough. "This isn't formula," she muttered. "This is laced with sedatives, strong ones. Enough to stop a child's heart." Ruth felt her knees weaken, but Carmen steadied her. "We're calling Marcus," she said firmly. Carmen's son-in-law, Detective Marcus Johnson, worked in the Child Crimes Unit. Within moments, she was on the phone, her voice low but urgent. "Marcus, it's Aunt Carmen. I think there's a baby in danger. I've got proof, poison in the formula. You need to get to the Sterling estate right now." Ruth didn't wait. She gathered every piece of evidence she had. The photos, the recordings, the bottle. Every step back toward that mansion felt heavier, the weight of truth pressing down on her shoulders. When she slipped inside again, the air felt colder. From upstairs came the faint clatter of glass and the murmuring of voices. She climbed the stairs one careful step at a time until she reached the nursery door, and froze. Dr. Sandra stood beside the crib, her gloved hand holding a syringe. The barrel was filled not with medicine, but with air. Ruth had worked in hospitals before, long ago. She knew what that meant. A fatal embolism. Quick, silent, undetectable. Her breath caught, but she didn't hesitate. She hit record again and pushed the door open. "Doctor," she said firmly, "what are you doing?" Dr. Sandra stiffened, her hand jerking slightly. "It's vitamins," she said, her voice faltering. Ruth stepped forward, eyes locked on the syringe. "What kind of vitamin goes straight into a baby's vein?" The doctor's face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Then the door behind Ruth slammed open. Victoria stormed in, her fury barely contained. "What is going on here?" But it was too late. The camera caught everything. The syringe, the vial, the lies. The woman they thought was too simple to understand had just trapped them both. Ruth didn't flinch. For the first time in her life, she stood taller than her fear. "I've seen what you've done," she said quietly, her voice trembling but strong. "And the world will too." Victoria lunged toward her, but Ruth stepped back, clutching the phone like armor. Somewhere outside, faint but growing louder, came the wail of sirens. The maid they thought invisible was no longer their cover. She was their reckoning. Victoria's scream ripped through the mansion like glass shattering against stone. "Jake!" she shrieked, her voice trembling with rage and panic. Heavy footsteps pounded on the grand staircase below as Jake came running, his boots thudding against the polished floor. Ruth stood her ground in the nursery, clutching baby William tightly to her chest. The child stirred weakly but safe, his tiny heartbeat fluttering against her arm. For a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "I've already called the police," Ruth said firmly, her voice calm and unshaken. "Detective Marcus Johnson is on his way." Victoria's face twisted into disbelief, then contempt. "Please, Ruth," she hissed, stepping closer. "Who do you think they'll believe? A respected socialite and a doctor, or a black cleaning lady with no education, no family, no power?" The insult hit hard, but Ruth didn't flinch. She had lived her whole life being underestimated. She met Victoria's icy gaze and replied softly, "They'll believe the evidence." She raised her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Recordings, photos, test results. And your confession." Victoria froze, the blood draining from her face. You were recording?" she stammered. "For the last 2 hours," Ruth said quietly, her voice as steady as stone. Jake burst through the door, his massive frame filling the entrance. His eyes darted from Ruth to the crying baby to the trembling doctor behind her. For a moment he hesitated. He wasn't a monster like Victoria, just a man who'd made the wrong promises to the wrong woman. But before he could make a move, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, echoing down the long driveway. Outside, headlights swept across the windows. Several unmarked police cars surrounded the mansion, their red and blue lights painting the walls in flashing streaks. The house that once stood for wealth and power was now under siege. By truth, Detective Marcus Johnson was the first through the door. Calm, methodical, eyes sharp as steel. He lifted his badge. "Mrs. Victoria Walsh," he said, his voice carrying the authority of justice itself. "You are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and the suspected homicide of Robert Sterling's first wife." Victoria's lips parted in disbelief. "What nonsense is this?" she scoffed. "You have no proof," but before she could finish, Marcus held up Ruth's phone. He pressed play. From the tiny speaker, her own voice spilled into the air, cold and clear. "Final dose to end this once and for all." The words hung there like poison. Victoria's face crumpled, panic flashing in her eyes. She lunged toward the door, but Jake stepped in front of her, uncertain. Then instinct took over. He turned and bolted down the hall. Officers tackled him halfway down the staircase, forcing him to the ground. Dr. Sandra, trembling, dropped the syringe from her hand and whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far," before surrendering. By the time Robert Sterling's car screeched into the driveway, the mansion was flooded with flashing lights, uniformed officers, and chaos. He pushed through the front door, confusion etched across his face. Cameras from arriving reporters began to gather outside the gates, word of the arrest spreading fast. Robert stopped dead in the nursery doorway, staring at the scene before him, Victoria handcuffed, Dr. Sandra pale and silent, police collecting evidence, and in the middle of it all, Ruth holding his baby. Safe and alive, his composure shattered. He stumbled forward, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "My God, my boy." He fell to his knees beside them, brushing William's tiny hand with trembling fingers. Then he looked up at Ruth. "You saved my son," he said hoarsely. "How can I ever thank you?" Ruth smiled faintly, exhaustion lining her face but her spirit unbroken. "By valuing the right people from the start, sir," she said softly. In the days that followed, the story exploded across the nation. Every headline carried her name. Socialite tried to murder millionaire's baby, caught by Black Maid's hidden recording. News anchors praised her courage, activists called her a hero, and people who had never noticed her kind before were suddenly inspired by her strength. Victoria was convicted on all charges, life without parole. Jake received 25 years for his part in the conspiracy. Dr. Sandra lost her license, her reputation, and her freedom, condemned for betraying her oath as a doctor. Robert, shattered but grateful, kept his promise. He made Ruth Williams full-time caregiver, trusting her more than anyone else alive. But he didn't stop there. Months later, he founded the Sterling Children's Foundation, a home for at-risk kids, a place where children like William would always be protected. And at his insistence, Ruth was named the director. The woman who had once cleaned his floors now ran his greatest legacy. At the opening ceremony, bright balloons danced in the breeze and the laughter of children filled the garden. Ruth stood by the entrance in a simple floral dress, tears shining in her eyes. William, now a healthy toddler with the same warm eyes as his late mother, broke free from his father's arms and ran toward her, giggling. "Grandma Ruth!" he cried, wrapping his little arms around her legs. Ruth knelt, her eyes glistening as she hugged him tight. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as someone who had made a difference. Robert placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just save my son," he said quietly. "You saved my soul." Ruth looked around the garden, at the children playing, at the sunlight breaking through the clouds, at life continuing with hope. She smiled gently and whispered, "Sometimes God uses the ones everyone overlooks, to do what no one expects." Months later, in a cold prison cell, Victoria watched a television mounted high on the wall. The news was on, a feature about Hero of the Year awards. There on the screen stood Ruth, holding a golden plaque, her name shining in bold letters. The maid she once mocked was now a national symbol of courage, grace, and faith. Victoria's manicured hand clenched into a fist. But Ruth never saw it. She was too busy smiling at the children gathered around her. The world had finally recognized what power truly looked like. Because in the end, the invisible woman had done the impossible. She had turned darkness into light, fear into strength, and injustice into redemption. And the lesson was simple, timeless, and true. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They might just be the reason justice still exists.